I don't know if that makes it better or worse to have this blinding light in my eyes. I feel like maybe better. I don't know. All right, well, this is chapter 8, and chapter 8 is about the next age group. If you notice, we're on a trend. We're kind of on a roll here, talking about each age group. And we talked about the youngest age group last chapter, and so now we're talking about adolescents, young adults, and full-fledged adults here. So let's go ahead and get started. I decided to skip the chapter objectives this time and see how it goes. Let's introduce this topic. This is about adolescents and young adults as well as adults. And so who are we talking about? Well, this is age 10 to 24 for adolescents and young adults, from puberty to maturity, and then adults, the beginnings of maturity, so to speak, physical maturity, I suppose, and all the way up to the beginning of being elderly, right? So if you think about all the things that happened during this time, right? This time is really about leaving the identity that you receive from your parent or parents and becoming an independent individual. This is your driver's license. You usually have a first romantic partner. Maybe you're finding your life partner. Maybe you're getting married. Maybe some people are going to have children. Maybe first job, second job. Maybe stepping into your first professional job. Graduating from high school, college, living away from home, perhaps for the first time. Right? So this is a major step in life, and it covers a lot of years. You might notice that this chapter is a little bit longer than the other ones. Well, it's probably because there's a lot of things going on during this time. I mean, we're covering 54 years between adolescence and the end of adulthood. So it is some of the best health of our lives. People are really kind of coming into their stride as they are an adolescent. Maybe they're picking up healthy routines, they're exercising, maybe they're playing a sport, and so they're spending a lot of time focused on the health and the strength of their body. And so this may be the healthiest time of their life. But it's also shaping the health, lifestyles, and behaviors that may solidify during this time period and stay with them for life. And so it's like the concrete is still dry, it's still wet, but it's drying quickly. And so I always tell people who are younger, if you will change your behavior here and adopt something healthy, like eating your vegetables without deep frying them first, it is likely that you will stick to that the rest of your life. But if you decide to maybe substitute broccoli for potatoes and deep fry those, that behavior may stick with you the rest of your life. So it's kind of it's a consequential time of life, and it may stick with people. Cigarette manufacturers realize that if they can be that first cigarette in people's lives, and it's oftentimes during this time period, it is likely they are going to stick with that cigarette for the rest of their smoking lives. So think about that. That means that if you start with a certain brand of cigarette, you're going to continue it for the rest of your life. But if you don't smoke, and if you don't smoke until you're 21, the likelihood of you being a smoker is so much less than is, say, if you were to start when you're, say, 13 or something like that. So it's a big deal. All right, focusing here on adolescents and young adults. These are the people who are preparing for adulthood. It is a difficult stage. Think about junior high, and at least for me, this was a really tough time. High school was a little bit easier because people have a little bit more freedom with having a vehicle and beginning to work. But in junior high, people are like stuck together, and people were much meaner. I was mean, other people were mean. And we're kind of just figuring out the fact that we're not children anymore. We're not really adults anymore. Kind of leaving the comfort and security of mom and dad, their identity, their money, their friends, their structure, and kind of stepping into our own and realizing, holy smokes, this is way harder than I thought it was going to be. It's like the rubber meets the road, and our ideas about adulthood, when I was 10, 12 years old, I thought every adult that I knew was, totally, idiotic and had no idea what they were doing. And then I stepped into adulthood and realizing, wow, I have no idea what I'm doing. And you have to either sort of figure it out as you go or decide I am not going to play this game and kind of retreat from even participating. Try to play it safe, not take chances, and kind of do what is easiest. So again, many health beliefs. Some people have decided that doctors and people who write research papers about health are quacks and they don't know what they're talking about. And my grandmother lived till she was 90 and she smoked and drank every day. These behaviors are adopted, and they are oftentimes solidified, or behaviors that maybe our parents did, like maybe our parents served soda for supper every night. We may adopt those as adults, or we may challenge those. We may meet people when we're 18, 19 years old who say to us, hey, that stuff is full of sugar and acid, and it's really, you'd be much better and you'd feel much better if you drank, I don't know, high pH water, something like that. I saw a woman yesterday who was drinking high pH water, and I was like, that's interesting. I wonder if that's real or that's just marketing. But anyway, it's oftentimes during this time period when kind of that experimentation, for good and for bad, are done, and then what somebody decides they want to do is adopted and maybe carried through for the rest of their life. And it's not like always people can change midlife. I'm still trying to change my health behaviors, but I noticed that I'm changing them a lot less than I was when I was younger. All right, demography. Let's look at the number of adolescents and young adults. And so in 2010, which is a little bit old at the time of this recording, adolescents and young adults were about 1/5 of the population. So that's 20%. And a little over half of the adolescents are non-white, non-Hispanic whites, right? So the number of adolescents and young adults is growing, but as a percentage, it's actually shrinking because there are so many elderly people as a proportion, and so the rest of the populations are actually shrinking in percentage, if that makes sense. And younger people are increasingly diverse. Our older populations are whiter, and our younger populations, those are the ones having children, are more likely to be people of color. And so there's more diversity among younger people than there are among elderly people. So in terms of living arrangements of these adolescents and young adults, about 1 out of every 4 of them are living in a single parent family. And so that statistic actually is interesting because when I was looking online, I saw actually a lot higher, that it's actually more like 30% of people are living with single parent families. So I guess it depends on how it's measured, like which specific people are you actually looking at, and things like that. But there's actually a lot of variation based upon race. About 50% of black children, so that's about half, are living in a single parent family, and then about 28% of Hispanic families. Those are the groups that are the largest numbers. So I have a chart here. This looks at the number of children living with a single parent from 1970 to 2021. And so what you can see is that there is a big increase in the number of children who are living with single parents from 1970 to about 2005. And then about 2005, it kind of begins to level off. And there's actually a little bit of shrinking here from 2018 to 2021. But still a very large increase between 1970 and the mid 2000s. And most are living with mom, especially back here in the 70s, 80s. But then by the time you get to like 95, you see a lot more single fathers, and then that number actually kind of increases a little bit in the last, say, 20 years. It's been increasing. So. All right, employment status and healthcare access. So for this group, the participation in the labor force, how many of them are working, have jobs, it's actually remained fairly constant. It hasn't changed that much, although there's a little bit of a decrease in employment among the older adolescents. So this is like the 16 to 19-year-olds, and they are opting to do more school-related things rather than working. And if you think about it, if your family can afford to pay for your car and your clothes and stuff like that, then it may make sense for a student to do ACT preparation, to study, an extra hour at night rather than going and working at a fast food restaurant for $10 or $15 an hour. That they'll be able to get into a better school, and that school will open up more opportunities for them in their future. So about 13% of the labor force is made up of people from this group. So while you may see a lot of adolescents and young adults in the fast food industry, you see a lot less of them in the insurance industry and the healthcare industry. And so anyway, taken together, it's about 13% of the workers. So there are disparities among race and ethnicity where especially black students are much less likely to be employed compared to white students. And so this matters not only for dollars, for people to be able to pay for their living expenses, but it also have impact on people's access to health insurance. Not everybody has health insurance through their parents. Sometimes health insurance ends when a child turns 18. But if they are employed, especially if they're employed in like a full-time job, they may have access to health insurance through that. And if they're not employed, they may not have access to health insurance. So. All right, looking at mortality. So good news here, a significant decline in death rates over the past decades. Why is this? Advances in medicine, the ability to keep people alive, and the fact that we are doing things to prevent injury and disease. This would be things like wearing a seatbelt, more focused on decreasing the behaviors that would lead to injuries, like wearing bike helmets and things like that. And then disease prevention. This would be things like sex education and vaccines. Male mortality is higher than female mortality because sort of the elephant in the room is unintended injuries, and the largest contributor to unintended injuries are motor vehicles. And when it comes to motor vehicle safety, women are much more likely to be safer than men are. All right. Most threats for this age group come from behaviors and not from disease. So what is killing people of this age group is things that are related to choices that are being made, like drinking and driving, rather than on diseases like heart disease. One could argue that people aren't old enough to have their immune system compromised or to develop the bad habits that would cause them to have most diseases. We're mostly dying of chronic diseases, which take 20, 30 years to develop. So, but there is a significant, well, hang on. I mentioned unintended injuries. Those are the largest contributors to mortality. And again, a lot of those are related to motor vehicles, but also things like falls and drownings, poisonings. Suicide is a really large contributor, and this is really sad. Because we look at somebody in this age group and say, wow, you have so many more years ahead of you. Life could really, really change. It may be painful and bad now, but there's so many things that will change in your life in the future. And oftentimes it's actually just kind of situational, and sometimes the decisions are made impulsively. So, but about 17% of mortality is related to suicide, and then also homicide. There are significant disparities among races. For instance, children of color, specifically African American children, are much more likely to be the victims of homicide. I have a chart here that is related to suicide. Now, this just looks at females, but this was the chart that I could find to demonstrate the rise in suicide rates. And so if you look here at this light green line, this is from 1999, and what you can see here, this is 3 per 100,000 people that are dying from suicide. And what you can see is that over time, this has really gone up. I think our book says over a 50% increase. So going from 3 to 5, which is more than 50% there. There's been rises in other groups, but really it seems like the largest increase here is among this 15 to 24-year-old group, which is the group that we're talking about in this chapter, so it's appropriate. Whereas other groups like 75 and older, which has probably been much more focused on decreasing suicides among the elderly, it's actually gone down there, but there's been a large increase there. Mortality rates, what you can see here is that over time, this is starting in 1950 here, there was an increase in motor vehicle related injuries, up until about 1970. That's probably because motor vehicle just access use went up significantly during this time period. But then it began to go down significantly. Like, this is an amazing decrease in the mortality rate due to things like mandatory seatbelts laws, the fact that people are it's harder to drink and drive. You have stricter levels of alcohol that you're legally allowed to drive under. So looking at morbidity. Morbidity is related to things like diseases and disorders. There are communicable diseases, specifically sexually transmitted diseases, and this group acquires about half of all new sexually transmitted diseases. And while many of them, like chlamydia, can be treated with medicine, sometimes the effects can last a lifetime. Like chlamydia, if it's not treated, can lead to infertility. HIV can last a lifetime. We don't have a cure for HIV. We have something that can prevent most HIV from occurring. I think it's a shot, but it can't. It's, I guess, a vaccine, I guess. But it can't. It doesn't impact someone who already has the disease. So this is a chart that just looks at not sexually transmitted diseases, but communicable diseases. So what you can see here is that AIDS, compared to 2010, which the rate was 7,000, to 2018, now the rate is 6,000. So there's been a decline in the rate among 15 to 24-year-olds over time. Chlamydia actually has gone up during that time, as has gonorrhea. It's actually significantly, well, I don't know what the percentage that is. Measles has also gone up significantly. So, all right, this looks at health behaviors of high school students. So, looking specifically here at unintentional injuries. So the focus here is on preventing those injuries and what can be done to prevent injuries that are unintentional. So these are things like helmets and seatbelts and not riding in cars with unsafe drivers. Things that are associated with violence that can be done to reduce the incidences of violence would be things like not carrying a weapon, not engaging in fights. Tobacco use has declined significantly over the last 20 years, and that's great news. A lot less people smoke. nowadays, or a lot less people, period, but a lot less specifically among younger people. However, e-cigarettes have seen a major increase in use. To 2017, about 42% of high school students were currently using cigarettes. So one of the things that caused tobacco use to decrease was the fact that the federal government increase the age limit to smoking to 21. But probably that is one reason, I guess, but probably another reason is the fact that cigarettes have gotten so much more expensive in the last 30 years. Believe it or not, when I was 18, they were, I think, $2.50 a pack. And so I think nowadays they're close to $8. And so other things too. I think that cigarettes used to be a status symbol, whereas now I think like iPhones specifically, are a status symbol, a way of showing that you're cool. So alcohol and other drugs. Alcohol rates are still pretty high, especially for this age group, considering many of them are not legally able to drive yet, or legally able to use alcohol. About 30% of high school students report that they drank in the last month. And so it's almost 1 out of 3. And then even more concerning is that about 15% of them report binge drinking, so that they're drinking 5 or more drinks if they're male, or 4 or more drinks if they're female. And so that's a dangerous level. It's much more likely to result in alcohol poisoning, in catastrophic drinking and driving. So, and then about 36% have tried marijuana. Physical activity and sedentary behaviors. The majority of high school students have not been physically active for an hour a day, like the recommendation for them is. And so if you think about that, that may not affect the high school student today, but again, we're putting in habits and lifestyles that may remain with us for potentially the rest of our lives. So men are a little bit more likely to engage in physical activity than women are, but when it comes to things that are sedentary, think about sitting behaviors, most students are engaging in 2 or more hours a day of computer use that is not related to school. About 30% of students are either overweight or obese, and about half of students are on a diet, which is not really good because dieting isn't really associated with being healthy in terms of like being a healthy weight. And in fact, oftentimes the more people diet, the more likely they are to not be a healthy weight. So some people, it seems like they're consistently on a diet, for years and years and years. So I suppose maybe it's related to the fact that diets are about like losing weight and oftentimes not about being healthy. It's not about nutrition, about controlling cholesterol or getting enough vegetables. It's just about losing weight or appearing a certain way. And so whereas I think healthy eating would be about like loving yourself, doing the things that are going to be good for you. Oftentimes dieting is about hating yourself and doing the things to shame yourself, or those sort of more unhealthy thoughts about oneself. All right, well, this looks at health behaviors of college students and looking at oftentimes the same thing. One of the big things here that's related to unintentional injuries, violence, is alcohol. Alcohol use is oftentimes a contributing factor to unintended injuries like car accidents, violence such as assault and rape. And looking specifically at violence, about 10% of women report being involved in emotionally abusive relationships, and it's only slightly less the percentage of men who report the same things. Unfortunately, colleges, specifically universities, are oftentimes not safe places to go and learn. Oftentimes, sexual assault is too prevalent in university settings. So, and I'm saying universities because community colleges often have less of that because people aren't living within the kind of the confines of the university. So. Looking specifically at tobacco, there's a lot less tobacco use among college students, especially if you compare them to non-college students. So maybe they're taking the health experts a little bit more seriously. Maybe the fact that it's harder to use tobacco on a college campus than it is, say, on a job site. Looking at, let's see, alcohol. I mentioned that earlier, but about 60% of college students report consuming alcohol in the last 30 days. Many of them, well, some of them anyway, are legally able to use alcohol. Probably one of the more concerning parts is that about 26% of college students report binge drinking in the last 2 weeks. And so that's more the scarier, I think, part of it, because with binge drinking, people are more likely to be involved in violence. Sexual assault is linked with binge drinking. Driving under the influence and being involved in an accident. So alcohol poisoning, things like that. Looking at specifically here at sexual behaviors, about 60% of college students used a condom the last time that they had vaginal sex. That means 40% did not. And so that's going to lead to unintended pregnancies, STDs. And so if you think about that, these are the most you'd likely say like the most aware, I don't know, intelligence, maybe that's not being fair to people who are not in college, but the most, like educated young people, they're in college. You could certainly make that argument there. They're not using condoms 40% of the time, right? 25% of them are using the withdrawal method. And so even if they're successful with that method in preventing pregnancy, they're likely not preventing sexually transmitted diseases. All right, let's look at protective factors. And now we're grouping those two adolescents, high school students, college students, young adults, all together again. So let's look at what protects people from the negative things that we just mentioned here. So protective factors are individual or environmental characteristics, conditions, or behaviors that reduce the effects of stressful life events, increase the ability to avoid risks or hazards, and promote social and emotional competence. So what are the things that will protect people from the effects of something bad happening? Somebody, fails their organic chemistry class. What are the protective factors that may keep that person from feeling like college is just not for them, that they are kind of they're not intelligent enough, that they should stop taking risks, that they need to play it safe, that the world is a harsh place for them. And so not every problem can be avoided. Certainly some of them can. That's going to happen due to protective factors. But everybody experiences bad things. But protective factors are going to allow some people to get up after they fall, whereas people who have less protective factors are less likely to be able to get up when something bad happens to them. And so we are social creatures. When we feel connected to other people through relationships or through giving, relationships would be something like school connectedness. I feel like my school wants me to be there. I want to be there. The teachers care about me. I care about the teachers, right? And then community service. I care about my community. I want to do things to better my community. Those things cause us to feel connected to our community, to our surroundings, and they are going to protect us. They are protective factors for us. And so when it comes to things like how do you prevent bullying, how do you prevent mental health problems, how do you prevent loneliness, there's no one size fits all, but things like school connectedness, community service, those things help. Community health strategies. Major factors affecting community health in age groups are social and cultural factors and community organizing. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So what can you do from a community perspective, a community health perspective, to impact the health of this age group on a massive scale, on a macro level? And so what this is saying is that community health in this age group, the one of the larger things that causes bad behaviors to happen, or good behaviors, good health or bad health, are social and cultural factors. Okay, so for instance, in some communities, what it means to be a 17-year-old male is to have a big vehicle with a big engine and drive really fast, right? So that's going to impact the health of that population group, and if you can change the social and cultural factors to eliminate or reduce that sort of culture, then you are going to see an increase in health outcomes, right? Now, this is tough because it's not likely to be solved by just a guest speaker coming in and telling people to drive safe. What's going on in the community that's causing people to define masculinity among that age group, 16 to 17-year-olds, as big vehicles and driving fast, right? And it gets really dangerous when you add alcohol. And so if that's what the community is about, that's the culture, that's what's going on, then that can be addressed, but it's going to likely include not just a guest speaker. It may have to include other organizations, reaching out to the school, reaching out to the religious organizations, reaching out to families, job sites, something to try to change the culture, right? So. And then, of course, alcohol use is a main problem here. So what are the cultural ideas around alcohol? It's interesting to think about the difference between Italians and the Irish when it comes to alcohol use. Both of them use alcohol on a regular basis, by the way. The Italians, though, have a lot less problems with alcohol compared to the Irish. And the thought is that it's the way that they drink that makes the difference. The Irish drink as a behavior in and of itself. They go to the bar and that's where they drink. They're not drinking with their families. They're not doing other things other than drinking. And I know I'm painting with a broad strokes here, so just give me a little bit of slack here. Whereas the Italians, they drink on a regular basis, during lunch with children included, but it's over a meal, it's family oriented, it's doing other behaviors, not just drinking. I mean, they're eating or they're talking or they're playing cards or they're playing a sport, something like that. And so the outcomes are very different for those two groups. And so I'm not saying we should drink more. That's obviously not going to really help our situation. The issue is, how do you change the social and cultural factors so that the behavior is healthier? Right? All right, let's look at adults. Right? So this population group is 25 to 64. So physical maturity is complete. Well, yeah, you're not growing, I suppose. And oftentimes people are entering into for most people, college is going to be completed and they're going to be entering into their professional lives. They may be entering into long-term relationships, having children, starting businesses, volunteering their time, working in their community, maybe serving in leadership in some way in their community. And then all the way up till 64, which is about the time that people begin exiting the workforce and transitioning into the elderly years. So it represents more than half of the U.S. population who are in this group. Their size is expected to remain stable, but as a percentage, it's likely to become smaller, again, because you have so many baby boomers who are entering their elderly years. The life expectancy at birth for this group is 75 to 80 years old. The mortality rates have gone down significantly among this group because of things like the fact that this age group is smoking less, and they are exercising more, and they're eating healthier diets. And as well as structural changes have been made to our society, such as more sidewalks where people can walk without being in the road, and they're encouraged to walk just in general by the sidewalks. We've gotten much better at treating diseases, and laws like related to seatbelts and so forth. So that has led to a general decline in death rates among adults. So much so that we generally associate death with being older. It was not always this way. I mean, for us, it's almost like we take it for granted that when a child dies or someone in their 20s dies, we're like, oh my gosh, this is so weird, and it feels like this never should have happened. But it's and I would agree that it shouldn't. But I also realize that historically, people have always died, oftentimes in much, much higher rates during all age groups. It's just that now we've gotten so much better at preventing death up until we're elderly that it seems like a shock and something strange. So this looks at death rates among two age groups, 25 to 34 and then 35 to 44, and it breaks it down by race here, or three races, obviously not all of them here. What you can see among whites, non-Hispanic whites, is unintended injuries are much higher for non-Hispanic whites than for blacks and Hispanics, whereas cancer rates are much higher for non-Hispanic blacks than for whites or for Hispanics. Hispanics, if you look specifically at their 35 to 44-year-olds, this number is significantly lower than among blacks and among whites. So, whereas homicide rates for whites, it's in the 3s, and non-Hispanic blacks, oh my gosh, it's in the 40s during the early adulthood. Well, yeah, early adulthood, and much, much, much higher than for Hispanics or whites. So. And then the second stage of adulthood, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, among these same three groups. And what you can see here is that the numbers have increased dramatically for things like cancer for all groups. But again, for non-Hispanic blacks, cancer is much higher, as is heart disease. But unintended injuries are higher among whites and significantly less among Hispanics. So this chart is in your book, so I'm going to stop there. Cancer, the number one cause of death for adults. It's very interesting because it used to be heart disease, but we've gotten much better at preventing heart disease, so cancer has taken its place. The leading causes of cancer are the locations, I suppose, of where it starts. Among men are prostate, lung, and colorectal, and among female it's breast, lung, and colorectal. Lung cancer is primarily due to cigarette smoke, right? And then you have gender-specific cancers for men and women, and then colorectal, likely related to our dietary changes. Looking specifically at cardiovascular diseases, things related to the heart, again, the fact that mortality rates have dropped from this over the last 60 years. Why have they dropped? Well, we're smoking a lot less, we're exercising more, and we're eating better. All right, looking at health behaviors. So again, among this group, most people are dying from chronic diseases, things that are lasting a long time. Again, the definition for a chronic disease is a disease that is expected to last more than 3 months and sometimes last someone's entire life. So the risk factors that are associated with chronic disease are smoking, lack of exercise, poor nutrition, having a large body mass index, or I guess a higher body mass index, and then alcohol use. The good news for those is that we have control over all of those. It's not genetics. Awareness and screening of certain conditions. As adults get older, the number of screenings that doctors recommend for them increases. And so those are things like hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol, and cancer. All right, community health strategies. What can we do to try to reduce people's risk? So the role of individual behaviors, social factors, environmental factors, and previous influences on their health across the lifespan, right? So I think one of the things is focusing on here with the individual factors is realizing that people actually do have a lot of influence over their health. And so that if we decide to drink a green smoothie, for instance, that actually is going to have a long-term impact as compared to if they were to drink a Dr. Pepper, especially if that becomes a habit and they practice that habit, over the decades, right? Social factors, things like what are their friends doing? What kind of neighborhood do they live in? How much money do they make? Is there a lot of smoke in their environment? What's the water quality like, right? So, previous influences on their health. This would be things like what was their health like in childhood, right? Thinking about community health strategies on 3 levels: the primary, secondary, and tertiary. Tertiary is a fancy word for the third. So on the primary level, what can you do for everybody that relates to exercise and nutrition programs? So we just talked about the fact that most high school students are not getting enough exercise. So what can you do for adults and for adolescents and young adults in terms of helping them think about exercise more, right? So maybe that's having an exercise program at work or promoting them at schools, nutrition programs, things related to like community gardens, and just raising awareness of how people can get better food on their plates. A lot of times people will complain about the fact that, chips are really cheap and they're tasty, and broccoli is really expensive and it goes bad fairly quickly. And so, just helping people, think creatively about ways that they can put more nutritional foods in their diet. It's a lot of different ways that you can do that. It's interesting. We're living in 2022. And this year, there was a lot of talk in the beginning due to the war in Russia about how the price of food was going to go up, and about how third world countries especially are going to be paying a lot more in food because Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of food to them. And I was wondering, why wasn't there a push for people to have gardens in their lawns, by the federal government, by the state government, local government? I didn't hear anybody saying, what will be really helpful right now is if you would, learn how to sprout bean sprouts and alfalfa sprouts in your basement that you could eat, and not only that would that be nutritious and cheap for you as an individual, but it also would help other people in other countries, because you're going to be consuming less, and so it leaves more for other people to consume. And so things like that, and educational programs related to nutrition, exercise. So, all right, moving on. Secondary prevention efforts. This is more related to people who are at higher risk for certain things, like women, screenings related to women's health, and looking specifically at, say, people who are overweight, and what you can help them by screening and helping them to live healthier lives. And then tertiary is for people who have already been suffering, who already have the disease or the disorder, and getting them to, take care of, say, their diabetes by walking and watching their sugar, or maybe it is taking their medication and things like that. So, all right, well, that is chapter 8.